Noor, and before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I am joining you from New York City. It is the ancestral homeland of Lenape Um, and in our conversations about the future and our work on future thinking, it is important for us to acknowledge the past. So, a land acknowledgement is a formal statement that recognizes and respects the indigenous people as the traditional stewards of this land and the enduring relationship that exists between indigenous people and their traditional territories. And so, as we are gathered together here virtually, I also invite you to join me in this acknowledgement, but also I invite you to reflect on the land upon which you stand. And the history of the land upon which you stand. So I would like to acknowledge and pay my respect to the Lenape people, their elders and ancestors of the past, present, and future. And with this land acknowledgement and in our commitment in the Resilience Project to truth and to justice, we feel it's our responsibility to work towards reconciliation and to holding the power structures and the systems that are in place accountable. And I want my collaborator, Christy, to also introduce herself.
So my name is Christy. I am also co-producing Resilience with my company Ruse, and I specialize in immersive and interactive entertainment where the audience plays an active role in the story. And together we're producing Resilience.
Yes. And Resilience is a social media, Resilience 2032 is a social media theater experience, because I see many new familiar names. And for those of you that join us every week, we're sorry to be repeating this every week, but it is a social media theater experience that is set in the year 2032, 2 years after the UN Sustainable Development Goals were meant to be due and on the brink of another US presidential election. And 12 years from now, we are facing the consequences of climate change, of an increasingly data-driven ecosystem, and a widening gap of systemic inequality. So with Resilience, we are building a movement of futurists and visionaries by combining futures thinking with storytelling. And we do this through what we're calling social media theater, which is a format of experiential entertainment that we are pioneering, where a story unfolds across multiple social media platforms in real time. And it's driven by user-generated, user-created content. So you're invited to share your voice, to shape the story, and to co-create and prototype this imagined future with us. And so many of you have already been doing that. And yes.
Yeah. Okay, so I am going to share my screen real quick and talk a little bit about why we think futures thinking is so important. So this, and what we mean by futures thinking. So when we talk about futures thinking, we're not talking about predicting the future. We have no claim that we know exactly what the future holds. When we talk about futures thinking, we're talking about exploring the breadth of possibility of the future. So this point at the back of this cone, this is called the cone of future possibilities. The point is where we are now. It is our version of reality. There is one version of reality, unless you subscribe to multiverse theory, but we're not getting into that right now. And as we go into the future, there is an increasing range of possibilities. So futures thinking is the exercise of imagining different versions of the future and exploring the breadth of possibility that the future holds. So we believe that futures thinking is one of the most important tools that can be leveraged for social change. According to the Institute for the Future, 53% of Americans say that they rarely or never think about the far future. And that's a problem because studies show that people who don't think about the future vote less often, save less for retirement, make poor health decisions, and care less about long-term issues like climate change. So there's also a study related to this that shows that when you think about your future self, the same parts of the brain light up as when you're empathizing with a total stranger. So more or less, our future selves are like strangers to us, which might be why we typically prioritize our current desires over our long-term needs. Thankfully, empathy is something that we can practice and learn, and storytelling is one of the most effective ways to build empathy. Futures thinking, more or less, is telling stories about our future world. So what we are doing with futures thinking is an exercise of building empathy for our future selves, which can make us more ready to take action and actually change the future. Dr. Srini Pillay said, once the brain believes that something is possible, it will chart a path towards your goals that is radically different from the course it would chart without hope. So as part of these conversations, we are trying to introduce new ideas that we can use to shape the future.
Yes, thank you. And in the spirit of collective imagination and futures thinking, we're really excited today to have Makita Gershenson and Michelle King, which I'll be introducing very, very shortly, to talk about our imagining and reimagining of education and what is education going to look like in the next 12 years in the future. And specifically, this, as you know, or I mentioned earlier, that the year 2032 happens to be 2 years after the UN Sustainable Development Goals were meant to be due. And SDG Goal 4 is to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and to promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. And to unpack that, I'm excited that Michelle King, who is an associate director of the Ashoka U Exchange, an annual global convening of university faculty, staff, and students and social entrepreneurs. Prior to taking this role, she was selected as an Education Pioneer Fellow and worked closely with the Murmuration nonprofit based in New York, which is focused on equity in education to close the achievement gap for students in grades K to 12. And Michelle spent several years as a management consultant in the public sector, focusing on organizational strategy and change management, and also completed internships in several governmental organizations, including the US Congress, the White House, and Interpol. We also have Makita Gershenson, who is an educator, an artist, and the founder of Good, Better, Best. Her expertise lies in coaching and education, as well as social emotional learning and emotional intelligence. Makita is certified as an emotional intelligence educator. She's an academic coach for teens and also a digital behavioral coach. She has been leading mindfulness coaching on habit formation on a habit formation platform called Coach.me, and individually has coached over 400 clients from 32 states and 37 countries. She's a graduate of Stanford University with a BA and a master's from the Graduate School of Education, also from Stanford. Thank you both so much for being with us. We're really excited to unpack the future of education with you. I want to kick us off to acknowledge, of course, the fact that we are living the largest health crisis of our generation. And we have seen how much the education sector has been obviously impacted, not just here, but all over the world. And I was curious to your specific thoughts on what you think the pandemic has revealed about the future of education to you, or in light of your work. We need to unmute you.
I'll go ahead and answer that first. From the higher ed perspective, we have a lot of higher ed partners in the work that I do currently. And I know one of the biggest challenges right now is the technology and accessibility continued education for those who are currently enrolled in higher ed right now, because it's not just from the student perspective, but there's a lot of pressure around the faculty perspective. And how do you still deliver education in a way that would mimic the same quality as in a classroom? And I think even with that said, there's a lot of implications around the financial burdens and what does that financial structure look like going forward if we have to delay going back to the classroom? And I think there's going to be some long-term effects that we will see play out in the next 10 years around education, how the workforce looks like, just based on the fact that I would say about 15% of students are homeless across universities in the United States. And a lot of those students were stranded when this pandemic happened. So I think we're going to see a lot of gaps that we didn't necessarily see kind of go past higher ed really kind of play out in that post-graduation time.
Mm-hmm. Makita, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, the first thing that kind of comes to mind from working in a K-12 space is I was working with a lot of schools, individual schools, on community building and just offering different social and emotional supports. And so this pandemic kind of unearthed with all of the, number one, the funding challenges always. There's always been funding challenges, but especially now, a lot of communities are having really, really essential supports pulled from them. And so I'm thinking specifically of students that are special ed or needing additional tiers of support. A lot of that funding is gone now, and a lot of, kind of to what Michelle was speaking about, that quality of education. There's different learning modalities, and staring at a screen for a lot of young people and being in learning environments where teachers are kind of still figuring out how to, manage online. There's a lot of potential to lose a lot of growth that some students had been developing with specific service providers that were consistent, and yeah, just not really meeting students where their needs are. And specifically, something that kind of comes to mind is the summer youth employment program was canceled here in New York City, and that's 75,000 teens that were planning in a few weeks to begin their first internship, to continue their work, but really just that vision of for young people to think about their future and to gain skills. For a number of students, school is not the end goal for them. The goal is for them to get through school so they can get a job and move forward. And so, yeah, that's something that been reflecting on and thinking about how to support families and also young people in creating meaning in this time around, we go to school to get good grades, to get into a good college, to get a good job, and that's all been upended. And so, yeah, those are some of the thoughts that are coming to mind about this current situation.
Yeah, and to your point about schools being more than havens to some students, I know in New York City, they provide some of the meals, or they provide at least 2 meals. And so there's been a lot of, I think the New York City public school system has opened up the schools just so that families can come and pick up 2 meals a day. But the school system has been providing so much to our communities, and so have our teachers, which I really hope that we emerge from this with a deeper understanding of how valuable teachers are and the profession is, and what that means for our future. And so, speaking of our future, what is something that you hope will be part of our future everyday lives through the lens of education in the year 2032? If you were to imagine it the way, no boundaries.
Yeah, I get really excited about this idea. Compulsory, so mandatory, like awareness practices or mindfulness practices. Before the crisis, I was supporting some schools that had just started implementing 8 a.m. mindful moments. And so on the over the intercom, everybody would stop. The principal would stop, everybody, top to bottom, in terms of that school hierarchy, everybody would stop, and they would go through a regular practice of affirmations. They tap, I am smart, my voice matters, I am loved, I am healthy, and then they'd stomp, I am strong. And so you can imagine K through 12, if that was just attached to the Pledge of Allegiance. What are we pledging allegiance to? We're pledging allegiance to hopefully a system that is supporting us. More importantly, we're also kind of preserving our personal power. and creating habits of mind that allow us to practice resilience in a new way. So the first thing for me that comes to mind is just compulsory awareness practices.
Yeah, I also got kind of lost in my own mind loop on this one, but I think something I'd like to see is more conversations like we have here today. I would like more individuals to feel comfortable challenging the education system, questioning and holding those accountable that tend to hold up policies that create more divide and create a lot of tension. I'm not saying this lightly. Education is like any system, is very dense and it's very complex. And I think that you can't talk about it in a vacuum. You really, for the touch points, you kind of have to understand like housing and urban development. You have to understand history, politics, economics. And then when you zoom down to the student, is it just about the learning environment that's at home, or is it about the teacher, the access and resources? And I think when we start pulling back those layers, you find more and more difficult conversation that make people uncomfortable. So they avoid that conversation, that larger conversation around education. You find things like systemic racism, systemic sexism, and like codified exclusionary practices. And I think the beauty in those conversations and people having to reconcile, like, I believe in a system that possibly is not looking out for the good of everyone, you start actually seeing the foundation of what education is and why it is the way it is today. And I think you kind of see this outdated ideology and start understanding the how and the why of like why the rhetoric is still so strong and so divisive today. But on the other hand, you start to understand that you can understand policy from more than a superficial level. You can actually understand the implications of it. So like, for instance, when we talk about like some landmark policies that have happened, for instance, affirmative action, for instance, like, yeah, it's great. You say like, you're gonna put these students, inject them into an institution where they already don't feel like they belong. But then on top of that, now people think they're not there based on their merit. They're based off a quota. Or like desegregation, it's like, great, the Brown versus Board of Education threw out separate but equal, but they also got rid of a ton of Black educators. So it's like, not just taking a policy for what it is, but actually seeing the implications. And I say all that to say that when you have the bigger picture of the system, you're really, and the details actually, you're really able to find out the role that the education system plays in the narrative of this machine that says like, some people are meant to do very, very well, while it's also keeping people where they quote unquote belong, And so that's kind of like my thought process around why I think it's important for individuals to really kind of dig deep and get more comfortable. And that's what will really lead to that.
Mm.
Awesome. That before we start to unpack all of those layers, I just want to remind everyone who's listening in today that as we're going through this conversation, to please enter into the chat any questions that come up, because we will have a Q&A at the end. So I will be watching the chat to monitor any questions or thoughts that you guys want to share.
Yes. Thoughts are also very welcome. They don't have to be questions, but yes, thank you, Christy, for that reminder. A lot to unpack there, Michelle. I wonder, before we move on, when we talk about policy, especially that right now in light of this pandemic, I wonder whether you think in terms of education, whether we will be having a different conversation about the power of policy and or how much culture will play a role in informing policy, if you think it will at all. What?
That's a big question. I guess like where we are culturally and as far as education goes, I think culture, when I'm looking at like the history and kind of the progression of education, I think about it, I think that a lot of it's like kind of a man-made issue, right? There's like, we don't want to address it because it is such a big problem. Thus, we never write new policy on it, or it's always, there's a lot of pain points. There's always reasons why something can't be changed or something can't be done. And I think that we're reaching a point, I think from a social level, that people are like, that's just not acceptable. we need to make real decisions. The people that we put in power to make these decisions, you actually need to do your job and make these decisions and implement. And clearly with the systems breaking down, we have no choice but we have to figure out a way to move forward. So I think from a cultural space, I really feel like there's gonna be a shift that's gonna happen, whether that's for good or bad, but there's gonna have to be responses, because with the pandemic and how access has now been cut off to a lot of lower income families. And then economically, a lot of lower income families are also struggling. I mean, across the board, it's not even local, just low income families, but across the board, people are losing their ability to make money and support their family. We have no choice but to make decisions now. We can no longer put education on the back burner, because we're kind of to what Makita was saying, we're going to have a huge learning loss, which is the implication on our economy as far as like, what is our workforce going to look like in 2032? If we do not kind of keep these moving, we're going to lose half a generation, So that's kind of off the top of my head, but that was a big question, Noor.
You got it, Michelle.
Yeah, I think something, I'm not sure this is directly related, but I was thinking about kind of going back to, I think we talked about this on another panel or another conversation, is just this idea of like top down, like everything is coming from top down, and how I think that hopefully during this time, there is a call to action to really identify the needs rather than prescribing what's needed. And I think that regarding the workforce, I was just, last week brainstorming about the potential that due to this pandemic, there may be continued physical distancing. And so we kind of talked about maybe there would be block schedules where Monday, Wednesday, Friday, students are going into class, and Tuesday and Thursday, they're maybe doing virtual remedial work, or maybe they're skill building or actually doing internships, or they're doing apprenticeships. And so there's some closer tie between this time, this thought, like, I'm being educated. What am I being educated for? To what end? And so I think that is one way to, support people in hopefully gaining some perspective from this time, that it's not just about these tests that are really arbitrary and culturally irresponsive. It's about the skills that I'm going to leave this time period with. So just a few thoughts.
Yes. I think Michelle Proxel from in the chat asked, what could those responses look like? And I think she was referring to kind of what was outlined by you, Michelle. Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, actually, I think it actually touches back on what Makita was talking about with the top-down approach. It has always gone wrong. Like starting from the progressive era, like this idea of like, I see an issue in a community, and as an outsider, I'm going to prescribe like what's going to fix the community by enforcing reformations, on the community that needs the most help. But I think that it's really a call to action about like truly assessing communities based on their needs and creating an outline and a program that makes sense for that community, whatever that community may be built around, or whether it's education-based, whether it's location-based. I think we're going to have to like do a little bit more work actually talking about not just a panacea, but like what's going to work for communities and not just like the nation at large, because it's so diverse. It's diverse from an economic standpoint, it's diverse from a cultural background, and you have to be able to like assess, in order to, I think, really truly assess the need, you have to like make the pie smaller across the board. There needs to be more pies, not just one pie that we're talking about trying to fix.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that makes me think really quickly about disciplinary actions in school. So often, so in the trainings that I've been doing in New York City, we focus on community building as a way to prevent disciplinary infractions, right? But what are those infractions, and what is the codified language that's being used? And a lot of that is this idea that we're going to make students do a certain thing or behave a certain way, instead of thinking about what do our young people need? What are the needs that aren't being met psychologically, emotionally, physically? And so I think in the future, in talking about policy and just thinking about how teachers are being assessed, there's frameworks for teachers. And I think that we really at this time can go back and kind of revise and think about what are the words that we're using, what are the behaviors that we're expecting to see. And this is where I kind of geek out about behavioral design. What are we practicing as adults? Are we checking our bias regularly? Are we circling back with people? Are admins doing 360s? Right? Are we actually understanding that we're this really, really interconnected ecosystem? In theory, we're all here to support our young people, and yet no one's asking young people what's working and what's not. We're asking them to do what we want them to do rather than asking, what do you need to feel supported and how can I support you? So I think a revision of our disciplinary practices and in restorative justice or restorative practices, which is based in indigenous and wisdom traditions of coming together in a circle and coming to community agreements or community norms, thinking about disciplinary actions based on what the community has decided is culturally appropriate. And works for people based on their personal backgrounds, their personal cultures. And I think that that may support not only buy-in, but it's just people are seen and people are not being told to just sit forward and be quiet. That's not how some people in different cultures respond and learn. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to revise.
Yeah, thank you so much for raising that. That's so important. And it's also very relevant to what we're doing with resilience.
Michelle, you had a thought to add?
Yeah, I was just going to say, actually, for the culturally relevant curriculum, there's a lot of exploration going into that because they found that students actually, one, retain, learn quicker, and are more engaged when you link like culturally relevant curriculum to the student learning process. So that's very interesting. That came up too.
Interesting.
I want to just very quickly reference our conversation, the fact that top-down was mentioned a few times. You're right, Makeda, it was mentioned in our conversation for Earth Day on the future of climate change. And we did also bring up the concept of culture and policy and kind of the push and pull between both. And we kind of concluded in our conversation then around climate change that culture will, or someone quoted, I think, Naomi Klein, and her thoughts on culture informing policy as the future, like the power of culture in informing policy, specifically around sustainability and climate change. But
and building on that of having culturally relevant content is something we're seeing even as far as marketing goes, and in these sort of more commercial fields of things becoming more and more personalized as technology is able to accommodate that. Jamie mentioned in the chat of there's what was it, the experiential learning as an opportunity to integrate, and building upon this personalization of like, how can we address these student needs in a more technologically advanced world, especially if we're dealing with situations like this in the future. Right now, our screen time is not accommodating students' needs. Do you guys have any thoughts or ideas of how in the future those might be better accommodated?
My first thought is, I think about special ed and kind of the stigma that goes around, kind of floats around special ed and this diagnosis. And I was talking with a collaborative here in the Bronx about creating family plans where everybody has an individualized education plan. Why doesn't everybody have an individualized education plan that takes into account their learning styles and their a developmental approach to their learning? So many of the students that I work with, they're in high school and their reading levels are elementary. So when you give that to a teacher and you're like, well, the student is in 9th grade, they need to be ready for 10th grade, but they're reading at a 4th grade level, instead of having judgment to that, let's just get them from 4th grade to 5th grade. Let's create these reasonable milestones for them that support them. I guess that I just get really excited about that because it makes sense to me in my head. Just meet kids where they are, meet the families where they are, and support them in that way.
And oh, sorry.
No, please go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, I totally agree with that, because I think in higher ed, you see so many students underprepared. Like, I think, okay, at a bird's eye view, K through 12 is not on the same page as higher ed. Like, K through 12 does not get students prepared for the demand of higher ed. But I think even beyond that, it's such a defeatist feeling, right, that comes over students. It's like the morale is so low because they're like, well, I'm just not performing at this level. We don't even prepare students to how to say, like, hey, reflect on yourself, work on yourself. Don't worry about what someone else is doing next to you. It's so competitive. So they don't even have the tools to just say, you know what? I know where I'm at and I know where I want to be next. It's always about, I'm not where I should be. And so I think that kind of touches on what Makeda was talking about in terms of how can we focus and individualize this learning. I think it'll be infinitely better if we are able to provide students with the tools on self and not so much about competitive learning and competitive testing. It's just, it creates this more of like I'm not good enough, thus I'm not even going to try. And you see that a lot in higher ed. You see that a lot with people just feeling like, I don't think I'm ever going to reach where I'm supposed to be. Put that in quotations.
Yes. So let's talk about the future. Let's try and like place ourselves in the year 2032. What do we think are some like milestones or tipping points that could happen between now and then that would have the power to shape our everyday lives in the year 2032, obviously in light of education?
I'll go ahead and go first. I actually think something that could possibly happen, it's kind of outlandish at this point, but I think that something that would help though is if we were to forgive student debt. The people we want, blessings, the people we want to be the most active in our economy and to be the most productive in our economy are literally being held down by an anchor called student loan debt, okay? And I think that what people fail to realize is like the people that should be buying houses, should be procreating, should be like kind of living these full lives, having different experiences, it really shifts the different decisions you make as an adult when you have debt. There are certain things you can't do because you have debt. So I think the things that would be such a game changer. It could possibly even resurrect the economy from whatever it's going to look like after the next year or two, to really think about like, how can we just forgive the debt and get these people back in a part of being part of a more productive society, and how can we mobilize that? So I think that would be a huge game changer from a higher ed perspective.
Mm-hmm. I mean, education should be free to all at all levels, is my personal opinion. But Makeda.
Something that I have been thinking about is like a formation of a youth student government that actually ties into maybe it's a government class or something, but young people kind of using empathy mapping to figure out what the needs are in their community. So that could be project-based learning. So they are interviewing, so they're practicing that language arts, they're learning those skills. They're gathering data from different communities so they can learn math and data visualization. And then they're thinking about policy, and they're thinking about their own future and getting involved in leadership roles in a different way. So they can not only amplify their own voices, but also part of schooling is to consider the community that you live in. I think that would be really powerful if there was a move to mobilize and kind of get young people more involved. I think there's a lot of young people that feel, and just, I've heard this, I don't trust the adults' decision-making skills from a number of teens. And as a life coach, right, I'm not yesing or knowing. I'm just, oh, that's fascinating. And internally I'm thinking, yeah, and no judgment. Adults weren't taught to prioritize empathy. Adults weren't taught these skills. So again, if we can practice non-judgment, and that comes back to the mindfulness piece, if we can continue to just, I saw in the chat, it was thinking about considering the loss of the institution's cultures. And I guess my first question is, to that question of how do we save or advance those, thinking about what's the impact of those now and what's the value of them, and what pieces would we want to take from our current institution forward before trying to salvage them. Like, let's think about the impact, maybe look at history in a different way, where we're not having students study American history, but we're having students study the last 2 years. Or like,
Yeah.
let's have a debate about a policy that you would vote for. What would you vote for given what you know now?
Or at least making sure that the history feels relevant, and how is the history relevant to what's actually happening to us here and now.
Yeah. And I wanted to add, in terms of history, I think because of, so most people everybody's an immigrant, actually, in the context of this country. Everybody is an immigrant except for Native people. And so I think that students don't have the chance or space to also unpack their histories. And our histories are always also taught through a very colonial lens. And so I think that there's a lot of unlearning to do around the way that we are taught history to begin with. I think that there's so much space for history to be taught differently, and for the narratives that we are taught in schools to be different. I see you're nodding, Michelle.
Yes, because I think because especially with history, like it can be so easily written to exclude so many important facts. And actually, I know a lot of people doing quite some really great work around why it's important to know our full history, and why it's important for every culture to know their history, and how can we help parents teach that history to their students. So I think history, it's one of those really, it's a rabbit hole. You can have a whole other talk around the history, but I think it's important, just from that perspective of, if we leave things out, how accurate will the outcomes we want be?
Yes.
Yes. And I think also, I think someone mentioned like that perspective history, like whose perspective is missing from history? Whose perspective is missing from history? And maybe that's, a practice of just imagining, right? Like, what might it have been like? What might it have, and that's a tough conversation for people to go into. But I know that personally, history, I was not great at history because it didn't resonate with me. It's not my story. It's someone else's story. It's specifically his story.
Yes.
And really difficult for me to get engaged because I'm not mentioned. I don't see anyone that looks like me. And actually all of these things that I'm learning about when I'm, there's a right answer in history, like what's the theme, or like what's the impact? From whose perspective? The impact is that the economy went up, but also we're not even considering these people. So I think that, having students think about journalism now and using this technology to connect with people around the world to create a history now. Like what are we going to write about in history books? Who's going to be writing those history books?
Yeah.
What are the stories we're going to tell?
I have to say that's specifically futures thinking really is. Is that what you were going to say, Christy, too?
Yeah, they're flip sides of the same coin of like who tells the history and who tells the future. And yeah.
And I have to say, Jamie, I just want to read out Jamie's comment. History should be thought now from the perspective, I think you meant taught, right? From the perspective of all of us as global citizens, which is very new and not applied to looking behind us yet, only forward. Yes. So this is just a reminder that you can please do send in your questions. I want to call out, if I may, on Lena, who is my mom, who happens to be on this call. Lena, There you are. Because she is also an educator, and a theater artist, and has been a pioneer in introducing theater and the arts in education at all levels in the Middle East. And so I want to make use of your time since we have you. I wonder your thoughts on, we talked about that, like the importance of having access to, or access to education being a right, but through your work in trying to introduce the arts in education, how important do you think the arts should be?
Thank you. Thank you, Noor. Thank you, Christy. And it was really interesting and inspiring to hear Michelle and Makeda speak about education. And that made me think further of quality education, which is the fourth, right? It's the fourth SD, one of the SDG goals.
Yes.
Now, quality education is something quite relative. What is quality education in Africa is different than in the Middle East, it's different than in America, it's different than in Europe. And there are so many differences and variations in quality education. And you spoke about free education. Free education happens only in the Nordic countries, actually, in North Europe, because these are very rich countries and they strongly believe in human rights. And they believe that quality education is the essence and the stepping stone for any kind of development, whether it's economic, political, social. Having said that, in the Middle East, at least in Jordan, education, primary education up to high school is free in public schools. But there is a difference, there's a gap between public schools and private schools, where public schools are in the decline in their quality education, unfortunately. And I think this happens globally. And private schools, which are very expensive, provide quality education, where the arts are a major component of the curriculum. And same is the case in public schools in the Nordic countries. In the Nordic countries, they don't have private schools. Education is free to all and it's accessible to all. So there is no discrepancy between poor and rich. And this is a gap that creates inequality, a feeling of injustice among people who of low income, and low income families will increase actually because of the pandemic crisis. So the arts, when the arts are a major part, an integral part of the education, you will definitely have young people who will graduate with life skills. And somebody mentioned life skills in the chat, and thank you for that. Why are arts important? Because when young people are exposed to theater, music, and dance at an early age, they are getting skills that are not provided by science, math, and other subjects. And in the 21st Century Skills document, which is related to education, and it was published, I think, 10 years ago, and it included many educators from the US. Unfortunately, what was mentioned in the 21st century skills needed for young people to be able to deal with the challenges globally of this world and the changing values, they added arts and language to science, math, etc. So this realization should be adopted by all education authorities, because the arts do provide the young people with the skills to deal with human nature, to deal with human behavior, to understand history. You mentioned history. If young people are given drama in education at an early age, then that strategy of using drama, which includes role-playing, improvisation, storytelling, and story improvisation, you know, all the elements that go along with drama in education, which were created by educators in Britain in the early 60s by experts like Dorothy Heathcote and Gavin Bolton and many others, which I relied on for my education when I did my master's on drama and theater in education when I studied in Britain, and I used it as a methodology in Jordan, and it became popular in the Middle East. It teaches young people how to discover information. It goes against transmission teaching, which is quite popular globally. When young people take drama in school, they learn how to read the subtext. They learn how to analyze, how to be critical thinkers. And that is what is needed to understand cultural diversity, to respect other human beings. So it is we call it an active learning experience through drama and theater. And I don't mean theater as young people participating in a school play, which is great in itself. It has value, but it usually ends up with young people or students who are outspoken, very creative and talented, and it leaves out the rest. In drama in education, we give an opportunity and a platform for all kinds of students with different capacities and intelligences. And now we're talking about social intelligence and other kinds of intelligence, not only math and science. It gives them an opportunity to explore, to discover things through role playing and improvisation. I won't go into technical things, but once young people are exposed to that throughout their schooling, not only in the elementary level, but from grade 1 to grade 12, if they are given that opportunity, there will be less violence in the world. There will be more social intelligence. And I love what Mikida said about compulsory awareness practices. Drama and arts actually compel you to be aware of your surroundings, to be aware of human behavior and differences in our behavior, to be aware of your inner self, and to be respectful, to love yourself and hence love others. All of this comes with drama. It also teaches you to be compassionate and to be creative. Creativity is essential in our world today. Without creativity, you can reach nowhere. So through drama and theater, young people are given the platform to be creative. And it is also essential and meaningful to what is called, in Arabic, we say kaslanin, like non-achievers in education, which is a horrific description of people who have special needs or who are lazy. They are described as lazy, and their academic achievement is very low. Drama actually inspires these young people and gives them the skill to be better achievers. It gives them confidence in themselves. All of these things, all of these decision-making skills, in drama, young people through improvisation have to deal with conflict, because that's what drama is about. So when young people are in role, actually practicing rather than having them as case studies, problems that they need to resolve through role playing, they are gaining language skills, expression, how to use, and how to convince others of their point of view. So dialogue, a lot of things. So imagine all of these skills can be gained by theater alone. We haven't spoken about dance and music yet. And unfortunately, they're not adopted by education authorities. You rarely see drama teachers in public schools. You rarely see music teachers in public schools. So for the future, if we want to have a future in 12 years time, I think it's too short, but if arts are applied as an integral part of education, I think we will have a better world. We will have people who will be able to cope with the challenges of the world, because again, drama is about human behavior. Once we understand that, and practice it, we will be able to deal. Young people will be able to deal with all the challenges that they might face in the future.
Thank you. Yes, and actually, on that note, what do you think, Michelle and Makeda, like we could be doing today to create a better world for our future selves in the year 2032? Like, what's your call to action from our audience as we close out our conversation?
The first thing that comes to mind for me is kind of using this quarantine to get to know yourself better.
Mm-hmm.
So oftentimes we're either thinking like, we have to change the world. We have to change our own practices and our own headspaces and our own reactions to adversity. And so I think that what I'm working with a number of clients on is just kind of redesigning their own version of good. And that's part of what good, better, best is right. Best case scenario, maybe outside of yourself. Better is kind of knowing what steps to take, but good is just knowing where you are and what's available to you. And so I'm working with a number of teams right now to identify which of the sustainable development goals they're really passionate about. And part of we're doing like a small project-based learning summer experience where they're going to be doing research on that specific sustainable development goal and then sharing what they learned. So using social media in a way to increase awareness in their own circle of friends about things that they're passionate about, but then tying in that behavior modification, really designing. Professor BJ Fogg out of Stanford has this process called Tiny Habits. And so it's about behavioral design, and it's creating new existing habits on anchor habits. So anchor habits are things you don't have to think about. Excuse the sirens. So yeah, I think that using this time to get to know yourself better, get to know what you're passionate about, and then going through a process with support of someone else, maybe not in your household, but someone that can offer that some space just to help you identify like what is the next smallest action that I can take that will move me in the direction of the sustainable development goal that I'm passionate about, and how do I continue to do that regularly and then get other people involved.
I think so. I think in time of crisis, it's so easy for us to worry about ourselves and worry about our immediate surroundings. I think this is also a really good time for people to find out how they can be supportive and use whatever skills that they have to like give back to the community. And whatever that community may be, maybe it's just you checking in on friends or checking in on maybe there's elderly people in your neighborhood that might need your help. Like, what are you able to do as an individual? I think extending yourself just beyond worrying about yourself, I think will pay in dividends like as we go forward. If everyone were to think like that, it's creating more of a I would say a support system without having to rely on systems. So that's what I would definitely say. I would think people can really start thinking about, because this isn't going away anytime soon. And I think it's a really good time to assess your role in doing what you might think is good at this point.
Awesome. Thanks, guys, for those calls to action. I want to take a couple of questions from people in the chat. The first one I want to pose is from Jamie. It's essentially a hypothetical. Okay, hypothetical, education is free now. And then the question is, what changes about the structure of schools, who's going to school, what they're studying, etc. So if education was free, what do you think changes that would spur?
I guess since I brought it up. So I actually think, I hope I can answer this question in full, but it's not so, I would say from, if education was free from a higher ed perspective, I first think about the spending of universities will change, how much a university spends per student. So I think right now, like stat-wise, the United States spends about over $30,000 per student that goes to school versus that world average is 15,000. And also looking back to, there's a lot of countries that that pay for school in the higher ed realm because the costs are lower, the spending's lower, the government can step in and actually help. And so I think from a perspective of how much money we put into into education and then how much those institutions spend, that right off bat will change. From a structure perspective, if all school was free, let's even assume that it's like quality education, like quality education is free. I think, I don't know if it's so much that I can speak to the structure, but I think the outcome would be literacy rates will increase. I think we will have a more educated population, which means we have a more productive population. So I can't really speak to the structure. And then I think there was also, what was the other part? It was like structure, who goes to school. I actually think more people will go to school. And speaking, kind of going backwards to what Noor was talking about with, the value of the teacher. It used to be a high honor to be a teacher. And now no one wants to be a teacher because you have to go in debt to become one. And then you're not paid even enough to cover that debt. So I think that more people will go to school. I think we will be smarter. I think we'll be more productive. I think our economy will also benefit. And I think students will benefit. And I think kind of still tying into the transformation that still needs to take place from a learning, how we learn standpoint, I think that's still an element that's a really big deal too. So it's like, it's great, it's free, but we still need to transform what we're teaching, how we're teaching, why we're teaching, just to put that out there. So that's just like my first thoughts off that.
Cool. That's great. Makita, anything you want to add to that?
Well, Makita, I would love for you to unpack STREAM.
Oh, that was from
in the chat.
Yeah, really briefly about the structure of schooling and who goes. I've been thinking more and more about peer-to-peer teaching. So who's teaching, what's being, I just have this vision of like 8th graders teaching 6th graders. And the teacher's role being that of a coach and more around mindset or more around building resilience and that social advisory support. So I don't know if that speaks specifically to what would happen if education was free, but just in thinking about the structure of schooling, kind of moving away from the sage on the stage, the adult knows all the things, to more of a peer crowdsourcing, right? Community where young people are showing up in spaces, maybe affinity spaces, where they are focused on things that they need to learn, and they have relationships with those that are teaching them, and it's culturally responsive, and they're using the medias that work for them. They're, if they're kinesthetic, they're, using their learning styles to express themselves. So I think that that's the first thing that comes to mind around the structuring of school or who's going. And yeah, STREAM is just something that's been in my mind for probably the last six years, but just this idea that STEM is very technical, science, technology, engineering, math. Yes, I was thinking mechanical engineering, but, and then STEAM is adding the arts. And I've just had this idea about our education being more fluid and more organic, thinking again, just kind of going back to what are the seeds that we're planting, and STREAM just being more of this organic way of looking at these different topics that we're studying, but with the lens of we need to revise this, all of it. We need to revise all of it. It wasn't working. That's part of what I think this pandemic is really shining a light on, is that what we've been doing for however long we've been tracking has gotten us to this exact point. And so if we can think about, I think about all the funding, right? There has been all these funding cuts, but if the funding can maybe go to corporations who are taxed, right, on their corporate social responsibility. And so every corporation has to put a certain amount of money into a zip code or into a specific SDG goal or some, yeah, I envision partnerships. Number 17 of the Sustainable Development Goals comes to mind.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how can we use the resources that are present? How can we distribute them in a more equitable way? And how can we really just get down to the basis of what people need and start from that part?
Yeah.
Start with what we need.
Continuing on this theme of STEAM and STEM, from Ashley, we have, is there a reason why math and science and math need to be separated from the arts? And like where are the roots of that separation? And then also from Vicky, asking about incorporating life skills. And I'm curious, if you have thoughts of like why they're separated, do they need to be separated? And if the answer is no, they don't need to be separated, how might we integrate all of these different disciplines in education?
So I'm actually going to think back to like when I was in Latin class and thinking about what curriculum looked like way back then. It wasn't around, it was about the philosophies, humanities. It incorporated all these things in one. I think we grew into this idea of curriculum having to be separated in more recent times, in more modern times. So I definitely see where Ashley's going. I don't think they need to be separated. I think we just gotten to the point where it's like, let's create this structure. Let's make every kid fit into this structure of grades. Like, this was, once again, when I say it was all man-made, it was man-made at the end of the day. So I don't think there's this idea that it has to be this way. It wasn't always this way. I forgot my second point to that, but yeah, immediately I think about like going back, it just wasn't always like this. There wasn't this like separate, this need for different, I would say, topics to be separate within academics.
Yeah, I think that's it for questions from the audience, right, Christy?
Yeah, I mean, we can unpack a little bit more, like Vicky's question. That's my mom, so I know a little bit more about what she's getting into of like incorporating life skills and what life skills are valuable of like, I think like things like budgeting or productivity, social skills, I know is huge in Makita's work. So maybe unpacking a little bit of what life skills could be incorporated and which ones you think are important or should be incorporated into our education.
Oh, I was going to say. No, I was just like, that's what it was. The second part was the life skills, but go ahead, Makita. Whatever you don't say, I'll say something.
I was just, I was typing to Vicky. Yes, life skills. Yes, life skills. I don't think that we give them, and I know that we don't give them enough space, and they've kind of been pushed. I was thinking about like home ec. What happened to home ec?
By home ec, you mean home economics?
Oh, home economics. I remember being able to, in high school, I was able to test out of that. And I wish I hadn't, because I can't sew, I can't cook, there's so many things that I can't do. I think financial literacy is huge. I'm not sure why we teach math without tying it into something that's meaningful for young people. I know that, yeah, Michelle, maybe you can.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just responding like, yeah, I don't know why. I don't know why that is either. It's actually funny. I was talking to my mom, like, we've had this conversation a couple of times. She's like, we had to take a finance class. Like, we knew what bank accounts, savings accounts, we knew about checks in high school. Like, all these things were part of the curriculum. I don't know why I moved away from that, but like, yes, life skills, the life skills that I think we've all been forced to try to reach back onto now in this pandemic situation, like you're sewing. Everyone's like, oh, wait, I know how to sew. Let me make a face mask. These very simple basics. I think this pandemic has really has brought us back to that. Like, what do we need to know? Because even financial literacy, like, it's huge now. Like, if you lost your job, how do you handle your finances? What resources can you reach out to if you're struggling? People don't know where this information is because we haven't been forced to find it. And it's just not talked about as we grow up, unless your parents sit down and teach you about these life skills. But I think it's not just I think, yes, it should be part of the academics. I definitely think it does, because when you go, especially once again, when you come up and you end up in higher ed, it's like, you'd be surprised. Students don't know how to do a lot of basic things. And let's say you were a student that necessarily never participated in like a student club, or you lose kind of your socialization skills if you've never been a part of that until higher ed. And so you lose out on the overall experience of college, right? So I think it's definitely something that is super important. It definitely needs to be injected back into schools. Just like, how do you take care of yourself on a very basic level?
Yeah. Marley commented in the chat, the high stakes testing in the early 2000s meant anything not related to tests were cut. And I think that ties back to something that I picked up on earlier, was this this competition culture of like comparing to each other and comparing to like who's getting the highest grades, and this measurement of how teachers were assessed of like how well they're doing their job. So my question then to that would be, how might we create a system that overrides this like set of metrics that are not serving our students?
Yeah, that I love that point. And I think for me, the first thing that I keep going back to is just this point of reference. Like each individual has their own best. Their own best is going to be different than the person next to them. And so if there is a way that we could support, there is some engagement that comes from competition, but if we were competing with our future self, right? Like, we want to be at this point, right? And at the end of 8th grade, I want to be here. And that's kind of the bar that we're using, is that internal piece. Because I do think that with all of the focus with more, and even in the productivity world as a digital coach, people want everything to be, and sometimes that's just not the reality of what's possible and what they have access to changing. And so in terms of life skills, something that came up and popped up was just like decolonizing our communication. Really thinking about how we speak to ourselves and how we are using language. Yeah, I think life skills will look different. And a lot of the things are the same, but I feel like our lens to them hopefully will be different given the pandemic.
Yes.
And actually, I will actually add to that, because I think that like something you touched on that was really important in terms of the competitive nature and like, how do we kind of overcome this structure? I think it has to do with us, not just as individuals assessing what we value, but like as a whole society values. Because if you think about the power that higher ed holds, it's quite imbalanced. Like we have students finding validation through where they went to school, when really it should be the opposite. The students bringing the value to the school. And no matter where they go to school, you should be able to excel and reach and achieve. And you need to be able to be your best self without having to worry about being criticized, right? I think like when we talk about how do we get away from this, I think it has to do with like, where are we holding our value positioning and where students are finding their worth, and how do we redirect that? And that really touches on a lot of the work that Nikita is doing.
Yeah, that's
and I would say a number of the, just to build off that, a lot of the rewiring is for the adults. Because the adults are telling young people what they need to do, or they're choosing their extracurricular activities. And a lot of it is people being like, what can I do to get my kid into this college? I'm going to choose the actions and the ways that I'm going to spend my students' time. I'm going to spend my young person's time, because I'm the adult and have control over their time. It's a lot of it is driven by what is going to get you on that track to higher education, because they've been told, right? No shame, no blame. They've been told that that is the indicator of generational upcoming, or like that's the goal, right? Is to get the job or to get the, and so I think there's rewiring for everyone involved.
Yeah. All right, well, we are at the end of our conversation. I want to share the screen again so that you guys can get all of the information of where to find us and the project and our panelists. We are at Resilience 2032 across platforms, and then Michelle works for Ashoka U. Nikita is at Mosaic by Nikita. And we also want to encourage you that we are currently in the process of trying to fund this project. So if you appreciate the content that we're creating and want to support the project that we're working on, this social media theater piece, we would really appreciate it if you give a donation on our website, resilience2032.com. There is a link to donate. So that would be a great help. Nora, anything else you want to add before we?
Yeah, Michelle and Ida, thank you so much for your time and for helping us unpack what the future of education could look like. There's so much more that we can talk about, but we really appreciate you both. And thank you for joining our Brain Trust, which is what we've been calling recently, where we have a group of awesome experts, of which many are on this call actually, that have been informing and helping us shape the 2032 future. And so, yes, as a reminder, this is the second half of our call today is a creative exercise that we lead, which is part of our efforts to co-create and collectively prototype the 2032 future. So thank you so much for joining us for the conversation, and we would love for you to stick around for our creative exercise.
I heard a snap. Should we take a group photo?
Do it. You might have to stop sharing.
I do have to stop sharing.
Cool. Well, I mean, most people don't have their video on, so it might be a tough one.
That's okay. So, so in closing, yeah, if you guys are willing to stick around for the creative exercise while you turn your videos on, if you want to be part of our group photo, it's about 30 minutes, and we will be writing stories about an individual that lives in our future 2032 reality. All right, and I will. 3, 2, 1. Oh, I did the wrong key step. 3, try that again. 1, 2, 3.
Yay.
There we go. Worked. Awesome.
Thank you.
Cool.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
All right.
Let's do our
This is
guest.
where we go into breakout rooms. And Christy and I think we should just do 2 breakout